During the early hours of a June morning in 1969, a small gay bar in the Greenwich pocket of Manhattan, New York became the birthplace of pride. Facing oppressive legal institutions, hateful prejudices, and exclusion from mainstream society, these bar patrons triumphed against a police raid and propelled a worldwide movement for LGBTQ rights. This was Stonewall.
Something for all of us, and not men and women that belong to a white middle class, white club.
Stonewall was a moment when the most dispossessed triumphantly held power. However, they soon found themselves tragically excluded by a new wave of activists. In the 1950s, homophile organizations protested for legal rights and social acceptance. Organizers portrayed homosexuality as functional in civil society. Similarly, the civil rights movement and protest against the Vietnam War represented a popular counterculture that engaged with the mainstream. Founded in 1951, the Mattachine Society was the first American homophile organization. Nathan Greenbaum and Matt Funston write for the Evergreen University that
the new Mattachine Society took on a more conservative stance, advocating that homosexuals adopt heterosexual social and cultural mores. Gay activists still believed that homosexuality was a disease, and being secretive wasn't a political liability.
Really no legal protections of any kind, right? So if people found out that you were, or even if you were questioned, or people wondered if you were not straight, all kinds of horrible things could happen to you. You could lose your job, but there would be very little recourse. You could have all kinds of health barriers. Say you got sick, you went to the doctor and the doctor thought maybe you were gay. Well, those were moments where just being gay was what your sickness was, right?
Additionally, the 60s was a time of great prejudice against the isolated LGBTQ community. Academia and medicine believed homosexuality was a disease. Electric shock therapy and hypnosis were standard treatments for gay people, while more extreme treatments involved lobotomies or castration. Furthermore, homosexuality was criminalized.
An adult convicted of the crime of having sex with another consenting adult of the same sex could get anywhere from a light fine to life in prison.
The patrons of Stonewall took on these prejudices as they demanded new rights.
The bar was filled with queer people, and the big problem for the police was people who were non-gender conforming.
The owners of the bar, members of the Genovese crime family, were routinely tipped off to these raids in return for bribing local police. However, on June 28, 1969, the bar owners were not warned in advance. Around 1:30 a.m., 6 police officers swing open the doors to the Stonewall Inn.
Police, we're taking the place!
Puerto Rican trans woman Sylvia Rivera recalls,
the night of the Stonewall riots, we were all in the bar having a good time. Lights flashed on, we knew what was coming. It's a raid.
You know, Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, it was over for them because they knew that the police were going to treat them worse than anyone else, but also the legal system.
Spectators gather outside as patrons begin to resist arrest. After an officer hits an arrested woman with his baton, the crowd erupts.
Well, it just so happened that night a lot of us were involved in different struggles. Instead of dispersing, we went across the street.
This crowd, now around 600 in number, start to fight the police. Some protesters even attempt to flip police cars. Several officers flee from the riots, leaving the rest barricaded in the bar for protection.
The cops were actually so afraid of us that night that if we had busted through that bar's door, they were going to shoot. Someone yanked a parking meter out the floor that was being rammed into the door.
Garbage cans, bottles, and bricks shatter the inn's windows. Finally, outnumbered and cornered, the police bust open the inn's double doors with their guns raised. As soon as they take aim, threatening to fire at the unruly crowd, sirens start to blare in the distance. The New York Tactical Patrol Force broke through the mob to rescue the officers and put a swift end to the chaos. Yet, the gay community was triumphant. the inn's patrons made it clear to all of America that they would no longer be passive victims. This inspired 6 days of further rioting and protests in New York City. These riots gave a new energy and nationwide attention to the gay community. This push of LGBTQ issues into the mainstream was able to achieve unprecedented legal and social victories for the gay community, with every major American city having gay rights groups within 2 years. However, this push also tragically excluded the initiators of the Stonewall riots. Prominent lesbian activist Jean O'Leary addressed a crowd at the 1973 New York Liberation Day parade condemning drag queens. She argued that they were a mockery of women. Infuriated, Sylvia Rivera jumped on the stage.
I've been trying to get up here all day for your gay brothers and your gay sisters in jail that write me every motherfucking week and ask for your help. And you all don't do a goddamn thing for them.
People and organizations representing mainstream views, like the Gay Activist Alliance or the GAA, were more publicly accepted. The politically neutral GAA focused solely on homosexual rights. Mainstream advocates capitalized on Stonewall's opportunity for representation. Tragically, they were given more media attention, more funding, and more political legitimacy than radical anti-establishment groups such as the Gay Liberation Front or the GLF. The GLF criticized capitalism and the Vietnam War and supported the Black Panthers. Exclusion in LGBTQ activism meant progress was only ever considered in terms of the elite. Grassroots protests, once demanding queer liberation, began to sanitize their language and pacify their activism with gay pride marches to engage the mainstream. This co-option of queer liberation by mainstream advocates is evident in discrimination of more radical activists like Sylvia Rivera, who helped to establish the Drag Queen Caucus of the GLF. As Rivera continued her activism, founders of the Gay Activist Alliance observed that
the general membership is frightened of Sylvia and thinks she's a troublemaker. They're frightened by street people.
The gay community as a whole sees its opportunities to gain political power increase as it takes closer and closer steps toward being mainstream, more like the ideal citizen, whatever that looks like, right? So the wider you can pretend to be, the not necessarily straighter, but more acceptable, right? So not so sexually unpalatable.
Drag queens, sex workers, and homeless youth were the social outcasts who led the Stonewall riots and sparked the gay liberation movement. After the riots, they were discounted and overlooked just as before. Tragically, the Stonewall riots ultimately failed to unite queer communities. Intersectional efforts were drowned out as the homogeneous elite of LGBTQ groups neglected the diversity of struggles and experiences faced by other queer persons. This problem continues today in LGBTQ activism, like in the 2015 Stonewall movie. It erased the real leading roles of trans women of color by having a white, cisgender gay man as the protagonist. Despite the gains made since the 60s, continued struggles for LGBTQ communities include housing and employment discrimination, as well as facing disproportionate rates of violence. In fact, 20 states still don't consider attacks on LGBTQ people as hate crimes. Systematically excluding queer people from hate crime legislation signals that violence against them is okay. The Stonewall riots were a release of rage against a long history of oppression. This provided the first large-scale triumph for queer persons by demand instead of permission. Today, many are unaware of Stonewall's significance. With marriage equality and openly gay politicians, it's easy to forget the tragic struggles that queer people endured in the past and continue to face in the present. However, to understand how much progress has been made, one must recognize the triumphant work of queer activists and the tragedies that surround the monumental events of the Stonewall riots.